Hey everybody, and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about habituation and sensitization and how our brains adapt to stress. Our brain constantly processes various stimuli from everyday noises to sudden and unexpected sounds. How we react to these stimuli can change depending on two main processes: habituation and sensitization. These processes help determine whether our response to a stimulus will weaken over time or become stronger. Now, to understand this process a little bit more in depth, I recommend watching my Lanier versus Susan Shore device scientific explanation video, the one that's 30 minutes in length, and also watching my video on the inhibitory neurotransmitter, GABA. Now, while there are numerous processes involved in both habituation and sensitization, we're going to cover the neurotransmitters first, then we're going to move on to other processes later. Now, as I've explained in my previous video, inhibitory and excitatory neurotransmitters help regulate the charge in the neuron, which in turn helps the neuron fire either more action potentials or be more likely to fire an action potential, so to speak, or by dampening the excitatory signal, making the threshold harder to reach and leading to either a less intense depolarization or a failed initiation. In general, the brain's response through habituation and sensitization are temporary adjustments for the most part. They allow the brain to dynamically increase or decrease responsiveness to familiar or intense stimuli without committing to long-term changes. If the stimulus is completely removed, these adjustments, like temporary AMPA receptor downregulation or neurotransmitter level changes, will typically reverse quickly, and the brain's response will return to its baseline state. This flexibility helps the brain conserve energy and respond efficiently to changing environments. Generally speaking, the brain removing these adjustments really depends on the lack of stimulus. Now, very rarely do we actually have a total lack of stimulus. For example, a person with post-traumatic stress disorder, which is one type of sensitization, will have a pretty hard time actually recovering from this if they do not, for example, put themselves in a completely silent environment. Usually loud stimulus like engines starting or planes flying overhead or people yelling or anything like that can actually reinforce the sensitization continuously. Another example of consistent and constant reinforcement of the sensitization process in post-traumatic stress disorder would be a woman who does not address her constant and consistent, very emotional negative reactions like extreme fright after a traumatic experience of being sexually assaulted. So every time she sees a man, for example, or a scary man, the sensitization is reinforced and she cannot return to a baseline state, so to speak. Now, about neurotransmitters in the context of sensitization. In sensitization, the brain responds to repeated or intense stimuli combined together with a, for example, very negative emotional response by increasing excitatory neurotransmitters like glutamate and releasing, for example, norepinephrine in stress-related areas such as the locus coeruleus and periventricular thalamus. Now, this increase in excitatory signaling makes the neurons more likely to fire action potentials, leading to a heightened response to the stimulus. Now let's talk about neurotransmitters in the context of habituation. Now, in habituation, the process is kind of the opposite as per sensitization. In habituation, the brain adjusts by increasing inhibitory neurotransmitters like GABA in areas involved in emotional regulation. For example, if a person has a repeated non-threatening stimuli, and the areas such as the ventral prefrontal cortex and basolateral amygdala are affected. And this increase in inhibitory signal actually helps hyperpolarize neurons, making them less likely to reach the threshold needed to fire an action potential, as I've mentioned before. And as a result, the brain reduces its response to a familiar and non-threatening stimulus. This is also in part how exposure therapy works, which is a type of cognitive behavioral therapy in which a therapist creates a safe environment and exposes you to your fears, causing the emotional centers of your brain not to negatively react to whatever this phobia may be, eventually leading to the habituation process. And when the person is exposed to this in the future repeatedly, then their emotional centers will also not be as reactive. Now let's move on to another element of habituation and sensitization. Now, if we talk about the context of habituation, which we care more about, so we're going to be focusing more on it, there is also some downregulation of AMPA receptors. Now, you're probably thinking, isn't this the same thing as long-term depression, as I've mentioned in my previous video? No, it is not. In habituation, AMPA receptors are often temporarily removed or internalized in response to familiar non-threatening stimulus. This is a part of a flexible, context-dependent process. And as I mentioned, this type of processor removal is reversible because it does not involve structural changes at the synapse. Instead, the receptors are stored in the cell, ready to return to the synapse if the brain decides the stimulus should be noticed again. The brain continuously monitors the presence of the stimulus, so once it is no longer there, the AMPA receptors can be quickly reinserted, restoring the synapse's original responsiveness. This makes habituation generally a short-term adaptation that can be easily undone when the stimulus changes. Now, in the context of long-term depression-related AMPA receptor removal, now I will ask most of you to watch my previous video, but if some of you guys don't want to do that, long-term depression is basically a permanent structural change in the strength of synapses or connections between neurons. If the synapse is weaker, the electrical signal cannot reach its threshold that is needed to reach to a full action potential, which then will be transferred to the next cell. In any case, in long-term depression, AMPA receptor removal is a long-term change intended to weaken specific synapses. Now, this process is really prevalent not only in tinnitus, but also in, for example, learning and memory. Now, long-term depression is, as I've mentioned in my previous video, triggered by specific calcium signaling. So this calcium signaling is necessary for the process of permanent synaptic adjustment to be reached. Other molecular pathways that lead to the, for example, activation of enzymes like phosphatase, which not only remove AMPA receptors, but can also lead to their degradation or disposal. And another note, long-term depression often involves structural remodeling of the synapses as well. This means that the synapse itself changes shape or reorganizes, making it harder for AMPA receptors to return. This structural change creates lasting decrease in synaptic strength, which is essential for the brain to store certain types of information long term, for example, or also in the context of the tinnitus generation. Now, because of this structural change and receptor degradation, long-term depression results in a stable, long-lasting reduction in synaptic strength, ergo the tinnitus becoming actually quieter. And it persists even if the original stimulus is removed. Now, this next part is something that many people are confused about, and it is extremely important. The reaction to tinnitus through habituation primarily occurs in the emotional processing areas of the brain, such as the limbic system, including structures like the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, rather than directly in the dorsal cochlear nucleus. Now, the brain learns to emotionally tune out the tinnitus in habituation, which I guess reduces the emotional and stress-related response to the sound over time, even if the tinnitus signal itself is still present. This habituation process involves emotional regulation, not altering the synaptic strength in the dorsal cochlear nucleus. There is no objective decrease in the tinnitus volume because there is no decrease, or there is no permanent effect or decrease in the fusiform cells or the synaptic connections of the fusiform cells of the dorsal cochlear nucleus. Now, direct synaptic weakening in the auditory pathway itself is aimed at reducing the hyperactivity in the neurons that are generating the tinnitus signal. And again, habituation to tinnitus doesn't alter the auditory signal in the dorsal cochlear nucleus. It focuses only on reducing the emotional and attentional reaction to the tinnitus sound in the limbic areas. Now, one misconception that many incompetent quote-unquote specialists, like audiologists and ENTs, believe is that tinnitus retraining therapy decreases the objective volume of tinnitus, and silence somehow makes tinnitus worse objectively. Both of these, on a neurophysiological level, are incorrect. And I can't really blame them because the structure of the courses in university or in med school do not cover the true deep neurophysiological understandings of tinnitus generation. Now, on why tinnitus retraining therapy does not objectively decrease tinnitus. Now, tinnitus retraining therapy has very often been compared to a form of cognitive behavioral therapy, aka controlling your emotional reaction to something. Now, tinnitus retraining therapy aims to reduce the emotional and attentional reaction to tinnitus, not the tinnitus signal, quote unquote, itself. Now, while this may help a person feel less distressed by tinnitus over time, tinnitus retraining therapy does not address the underlying neural hyperactivity or synaptic changes specifically in the dorsal cochlear nucleus or other areas that contribute to the tinnitus signal. Habituation in TRT focuses on decreasing the emotional impact of tinnitus by working with the limbic system, responsible for emotional responses, rather than directly altering the neural source of tinnitus within the auditory pathways. Now, does this help some people? Yes, it does. But the problem is that tinnitus retraining therapy, while it has shown efficacy to some degree in decreasing the emotional reaction to tinnitus, it is not more effective than something like cognitive behavioral therapy or standard of care. Very often it seemed to be like some kind of golden standard in tinnitus treatment, where there are numerous other things like mindfulness and CBT, like I mentioned before, that have shown also to be very effective in decreasing the emotional reaction to tinnitus. It does not modulate synaptic plasticity. Now let's take a look at Jastreboff's neurophysiological model of tinnitus, which I think is, by the way, very funny, because this model is hardly neurophysiological. It presents tinnitus as a chain reaction involving the auditory periphery, auditory subconscious, whatever that may be, and the limbic system, autonomic nervous system, and the cortical areas for perception and attention. Now, while this model does capture the emotional and perceptual aspects of tinnitus, it vastly oversimplifies the complex neural and biochemical processes involved in generating the tinnitus signal. By focusing mainly on emotional response and reactions, the model doesn't account for the specific neural mechanisms like hyperactivity and maladaptive plasticity in the dorsal cochlear nucleus and, auditory pathway that directly contribute to tinnitus. It assumes that reducing emotional response will diminish the experience of tinnitus itself, ignoring that tinnitus sound originates from abnormal neural hyperactivity. Now, why this matters is that this oversimplification implies that managing emotions around tinnitus is enough to reduce it, which overlooks treatments like Susan Shore's device that aim to address the origin of tinnitus. It can actually mislead individuals into believing that tuning out tinnitus is the best possible solution, which at the moment is not too bad, but we do have various treatments coming. And this extremely inaccurate, to an extent inaccurate, neurophysiological model of Paul Jastreboff has actually caused tinnitus research to go back by decades. There was no good research on spike timing dependent plasticity until the late 90s, just because this was considered the best option. Now, Jastreboff suggests in his book, Tinnitus Retraining Therapy, that silence worsens the tinnitus by making the brain more focused on the sound. However, silence doesn't inherently worsen tinnitus. In fact, silence can actually give the auditory pathway a chance to calm down or to achieve this reduced calcium influx, which can actually lead to long-term depression. Silence actually enables the auditory pathway to undergo self-regulation, gradually weakening the neural signals that contribute to tinnitus. Rather than exacerbating tinnitus, silence does promote neuroplastic changes that reduce neural hyperactivity, especially for those who have a very, very severe level of neural hyperactivity. And actually, in habituation, silence can actually put the tinnitus at the forefront and actually promote habituation more than not being in silence for some. So overall, Jastreboff's understanding or opinion that silence somehow worsens tinnitus objectively is absolutely baseless. It is absolutely wrong. And if you take a look in his book, Tinnitus Retraining Therapy, he just writes this without quoting any research papers at all. So this is basically his own baseless opinion. Jastreboff also claims that, or his model suggests that the volume of tinnitus has no direct effect on a person's suffering. And actually, based on his own model, that is absolutely wrong. That's incorrect. Louder tinnitus can actually easily trigger sensitization because its intensity makes it more noticeable and harder for the brain to habituate to. This can lead to increased excitatory neurotransmitters in the emotional centers of the brain. They have a direct impact on the brain's attentional and sensory systems, making louder tinnitus more difficult to tune out and increasing the risk of a sustained distressing response. So he just directly contradicts his own model. And if you look at the study that he quotes in his book, Tinnitus Retraining Therapy, it's a study called The Validity of the Italian Adaptation of the Tinnitus Handicap Inventory. Focus on quality of life and psychological distress in tinnitus sufferers. This study itself has numerous misconceptions and numerous issues. It does not account for reactive tinnitus. It does not account for any other conditions that come with it. Relied mostly on subjective measurements, and there's also loads of self-reporting bias in the study he quotes as well. So him making a bold claim like this and basing it on such a not well-organized study is absolutely mind-boggling how nobody noticed this before. Not to mention, there have been numerous instances of Paul Jastreboff personally gaslighting very severe or reactive sufferers, telling them that they're not trying hard enough to habituate. And this type of behavior is absolutely unacceptable, even in a clinical setting. So basically, what do we have? Tinnitus retraining therapy reduces emotional reaction, not tinnitus itself. And in no way is it better than doing the same thing at home, like with a YouTube video. You don't need to buy $1,000 hearing aids for this. And it's not better than cognitive behavioral therapy or any other methods to address the emotional response. Jastreboff's model is very oversimplified. It ignores complex neural processes and focuses only on emotional and autonomic responses. Silence does not worsen tinnitus. In fact, it actually may help reduce neural hyperactivity, and it actually may help promote habituation. And tinnitus volume and severity absolutely does impact distress, and it absolutely can lead to stronger sensitization. So be very careful about what you hear and what you listen to from these ENTs and audiologists, because their understanding is based solely on the problematic Jastreboff model. My Discord server, where we have meaningful scientific discussions about these conditions, will be linked in the description and in the comment. So feel free to join and engage yourselves in our scientific understanding of these conditions.